Hey buddy, this is Charles of Side by Side Garage. On today's episode, I will be discussing RZR transmission gear reductions. Specifically, I will be installing a set of Polaris Ace 325 gears, as well as a Polaris Ranger loop. Alright, so right here we have the 19 Turbo S 4-seater transmission. It's already opened up because the last video I showed you exactly what goes on in the transmission as far as where the work takes place, how the input starts over here at your input shaft, your secondary shaft, and then it flows this way to your output shaft and your rear axles. Gear reductions can be extremely simple. There's always a drive gear. That's where the power goes first, and then there's always a driven gear. So in this instance, your input shaft right here is where the power starts, and it's transferred from your drive gear right here. This one is a low gear, and it's transferred over to a driven gear. This is your low gear on your reverse shaft. In order to do a gear reduction, what you're going to do is reduce the number of teeth on your drive gear, and you're going to increase the number of teeth on your driven gear. Now, one of the most common gear reductions out there is probably the Ace 325 gears. The Ace gears is going to take place right here with the reverse shaft and your stage 2 gear. So what you're going to replace is the reverse shaft and then that stage 2. Personally, I think that the Ace gears are good for 32 up to 34-inch tires. Anything bigger than that, and I would start looking at doing another reduction, either in your stage 3 or, depending on the machine, if we can do a low reduction. Now, your standard 2-seat RZRs usually have a 29-44 tooth combo right here, and then your 4-seaters usually have a 27-46. The Ace gears are a 25-48. The teeth count for the 2 and 4-seaters on that stage 2, that's not always the case, but that's usually what it is. A lot of people always ask me, if I'm going to put Ace 325 gears in, how much is that going to reduce my RZR? In order to do that, you have to first figure out the ratio of your stock gears. You can look up the teeth count of what's in your transmission if you go to a website like Park Shark or Babbitt's, places like that. To find out the ratio of your stock gears, all you have to do is divide your large gear, which is your stage 2, divided by your small gear, which is the gear on your reverse shaft, and that'll give you a number. It can be expressed like this, 1 to 1.52. That means that for every 1 rotation of this stage 2 gear, your drive gear rotates 1.52 times. Another way to look at it is if you take your small gear divided by your large gear, you'll get a percentage, which means that for every 1 rotation of this drive gear, your driven gear rotates 66%. If you want to calculate the percentage in reduction the Ace gears is going to give you compared to your stock gears, all you have to do is take the Ace 325 ratio and divide it by your smaller ratio, which is your stock ratio. So in my case, I have a 4-seater, so I would take 1.92, divide it by 1.7. You drop the 1 off, which means I'm dropping roughly 13%. It's 12.9%. If you have that 29 tooth 2-seat ratio and you wanted to go to the Ace gears, then you would take your 1.92 divided by 1.52, and you get 1.263. You drop the 1, comes out to about 26.3%. A lot of guys just say 26%. All right, so before I install the Ace gears, I want to talk about the low gear because I'm actually going to do a low gear reduction at the same time that I'm doing the Ace gears here. So the very best low gear ratio that Polaris came out with, in my opinion, is a 25 tooth low 67 right here, so 25-67. What Polaris ended up doing was getting away from the 25-67 after like the 2014s and then the 2016 turbos, and they went to a 29 tooth low gear for the 2-seaters and 31 tooth low gear for the 4-seaters. Now, real quick, you might be wondering, why would you go to a higher low gear on a 4-seat machine than a 2-seat machine? Doesn't make sense. Well, what they ended up doing on the 4-seaters was, even though they did a higher low gear, they did a stage 2 reduction right here that was a 12% compared to the standard 1K, whereas on the 2-seaters with that 29 tooth, it didn't have a reduction right here at the stage 2. Now, something that Polaris did that is really nice is that in 2017 on the turbo 2-seater, they ended up changing this input shaft so that the low gear is no longer part of the shaft. And then on the 2018 Polaris Ranger, they did the same design where the low gear is pressed onto the shaft, it's not part of the shaft, and they put a 25-67 tooth combo in that Ranger. So now that opens up the option on the turbo machines that you can drop in the 25-67 into your machine and get that much better low gear ratio for rock crawling. Now, some people out there talk about the Ranger low gear, that 25 tooth, like it's some super low gear or whatever, something new. In reality, it's not. Like I said, this 25 tooth low came in the 2014 1000s. The 25 tooth low was in the 16 2 and 4 seat turbos, and it was in the 17 4 seat turbo. So the 25 tooth low is nothing new. The only difference is that now it's not part of the shaft anymore. Since we're talking about low gears real quick, I want to touch on the high lifter and rockin' trails. So a lot of guys ask me, can I put the rockin' trails or the high lifter low gear inside of my transmission? For the turbo guys, no, you can't. For the RZR 1000 guys, can you? Yes, but it's not worth it at all. The reason why is because on the rockin' trails, they have this 25 tooth low, but then they have a higher high gear right here. And then the way that they get everything reduced is they do another reduction down here on this end of the transmission. That's why there's also a reduction in the front diff. The front diff is different on the rockin' trails. So whenever you do a reduction down here, that brings your low gear even lower, and it reduces your high down to a normal amount. So if you really wanted to do the reduction, that means you're going to have to change out your input, your high gear, because it corresponds. That's different right here. Your chain is different because it's 1 link wider, which is not really a huge strength increase right there. It's not really worth it. You're going to have to change out your sprocket right here, your low gear. You got to change out your output for your rear axles, your pinion, and your output. Plus, you got to change out your front diff. Okay, now that we're done talking about that, let's actually install the ACE gears on here, as well as put that Ranger low gear in here. If you want to install the ACE 325 gears in your transmission, you're going to need a good set of external C-clip pliers, some 3-jaw pullers, and then you're also going to need a press so that you can press the bearings and gears back on. At the same time that I do the gear reduction, I'm also going to swap out all the bearings that are on here. The bearings that come in the Polaris transmission from the factory are from China. They're not the greatest quality. It's kind of hit or miss as far as how long those last. So what I like to do is swap them out with Nachi bearings, and these are from Cryo Heat, and what they do is buy the bearings brand new, and then they actually cryo treat them before they send them to you. So the way that I do gear reductions or bearing installs on these transmissions is that I actually do it one shaft at a time. That way you make sure that you're not messing anything up. You don't actually put one of the gears on the wrong shafts or anything like that, and you also don't miss something. So like, let's say you're doing bearings, you don't accidentally forget to do one bearing on there. So I'm going to start from one end and just work my way to the other. So pull out the input shaft. Now on a regular 1000 or a general, where you have that chain across here, you can't pull out the input shaft separate because that is on there. So you actually have to pull these two out together. Well, you can't just pull out the reverse shaft and the stage 2 shaft by themselves because of how they mesh together right here. So these two actually have to be lifted up at the same time. Because that chain on your other machines is right here, you have to lift all 3 of these out of the machine at the same time. I'm not even going to pull those out yet just because I'm going to work on this input shaft. So what I'm going to do is pull the bearings off, pull this gear off, and then put my Ranger low gear on the shaft and put the new Nachi bearings on here. After you get the bearing off, use your snap ring pliers to remove the snap ring. Now, whenever you're doing a new transmission, all your snap rings should be fine to reuse. If it's an old transmission, it's got some mileage on it, you need to make sure that you're inspecting these, because if they're deformed some, then you want to replace them. Also, whenever you put them back on the shafts there, if they are free spinning, then you should just go ahead and replace them. A little washer in between the snap ring and the gear. Gears off. Gonna swap it out with this one. This is where you have to have a press in order to do gear reductions, because you got to be able to press this gear back on here, and then the same thing when you get to it, you got to be able to press that bearing back on there. Now that the low gear's on there, put your washer back on. Your snap ring pliers. Make sure it's seated. It doesn't spin freely, so it's good. I need to match up this bearing real fast with one of my new ones. New bearing. Go over to the press, press this on. Now that that bearing's on there, I'm going to put this one on. In order to get this bearing off, you got to get kind of creative if you don't have a bearing puller long enough, which I don't. So I actually set up something on my press right here, and then that way I can just push the shaft out of the bearing. I just pressed off the other bearing and put the new one on there, so now the input shaft is done. Now that the input shaft's done, we can move on to the reverse shaft right here. You gotta lift up on the reverse shaft and the stage 2 at the same time. Pull this one out. I'm gonna put the other one back in there. Whenever I'm doing an ace install with the reverse shaft, I like to start on one end of it and work over to the center gear, which is fixed right here. So what I can do is just pull this bearing off, pull off the shift dog, remove the low gear, and then put everything onto the ace gear, and then repeat the same process for the other half of it. Pull the bearing, pull the gears and shift dog, and slide it on the other side of that shaft. If you're not very familiar with the transmissions, a good practice whenever you're taking these apart is to just set everything in order. So if you start off with the bearing, pull the shift dog off. That way, whenever you go to put it back together, you make sure it goes back together correctly. Here you'll be able to see what I talked about in my other videos as far as this gear riding on needle bearings. Right there. And that's the last of that one. Now that you have the low gear side of the reverse shaft taken apart, you can put everything over onto your ace gear reduction reverse shaft. Just put it back together backwards. Now normally I would put the stock gear back on there, but I'm doing the Ranger low also, so I got to put the 67 tooth gear on there instead. Once that's on there, don't forget to put your shift dog back on. It'll mate up with these little teeth on your gear. So it's this side, because remember that side's for your parking pole. Just like that. Now I can press on my new bearing. All right, I got that bearing pressed on there. Real quick note, some guys ask, well, how do you know how far to press the bearing on? If whatever surface you're using to press it down on, it'll get a positive stop because it'll actually hit against the end of the shaft. And then you'll also notice a sound difference in your press. So that's how you know that it's actually all the way on there, because now it's flush. So we're going to flip this over, set it aside. Now we're going to switch over, take this bearing off, snap rings, the gears, shift dog, and transfer everything from this half of the reverse shaft over onto our ace gear shaft. All right, we're going to do just like we did on the other half of the shaft. We're going to lay everything out in order. You'll notice when there's a snap rings, you've got that little washer or shim, and then your gear is pretty much the same each time, right there. So your stock one you can set aside. Grab your ace shaft and just do it in reverse. Now normally I'd be putting this spacer and snap ring back on there and then pressing the bearing. If you remember my talk about the high gear spacer, I'm going to throw it on there instead. It's just a little extra insurance to make sure you don't damage the snap ring. So it just drops right on. You don't have to put the washer or snap ring on there. Then you take your bearing, press it on there. I'm going to get my new bearing. Real quick, while the camera wasn't rolling, I went ahead and pressed off the old bearings of the reverse idler gear and put the new ones on there. So set that aside. Next thing we got to do, pull out the stage 2. Okay, what we're going to end up doing, you got to pull the bearing off of this end, remove the snap ring, little washer there, and then you got to pull this gear off. And then it gets replaced with your Ace 325 stage 2 gear. You take your bearing, set them in order, although it's not as critical on this part just because there's far less parts going on here. Usually with this gear, what I do is go over to the press. So I'll put this in the arbor plates and then I'll use the press to press the shaft out of it. All right, I've got the gear and the shaft set up in the press and I've got it sitting on the arbor plates. That way the load is all on the arbor plates instead of using the puller and chancing accidentally damaging one of these teeth right here. All right, so here we have the shaft and the new gear. Now you can see how there's this machine surface just below the splined area. That's because this gear goes this direction. So make sure whenever you're going to press it back on there that it goes on there the correct direction. Just like that. Go over to the press and press it on there. Now that you got the gear pressed on there, take your little shim or washer, your snap ring. Now I'm going to grab my new bearing and press on there. All right, at this point, if that's all you were going to do was the Ace gears and the Ranger Low, you could go ahead and put these back in the transmission. Now on a turbo transmission, remember you have to mate these together first and then slide them underneath there and down into where the bearing sits. You don't want to force anything. They should drop in. Just wiggle them a little bit like that. And then we could go ahead, take our input shaft, drop it in, take a reverse idler right there. Next we could take our shift forks, real quick. Whenever you slide this in there, you have to make sure that you get the shift fork inside of the shift dog. These little parts that stick out are going to be towards this side, towards your input shaft. Make sure you get the bottom one in there too. Okay, and then at that point you can put the shift drum in there so we can just do a quick test. All right, whenever you put the shift drum back in there, you need to make sure that you actually get all of these in their respective little channels. After you get it together, just do a bench test. So there's park, make sure that that's up. Spin your input. After that, you can go over to reverse. There. After that, you go through neutral. Check low. Check your high gear. Everything works good. I'm not going to fully assemble this yet because I'm actually not done with this transmission. What I have to do next, I still need to replace my bearings on this shaft, and I need to do the stage 3 reduction from Optimum Off-Road. It's a 19%. Remember that stage 3 reduction takes place right here between this gear and this one. So I'm going to install those. While I have this out, I'm also going to do all the bearings down in here. I'm going to set backlash. I'll show you how to do that. And I'm going to put a Rock Ready UTV heavy duty bearing retainer plate in there. So if you want to learn how to do all that stuff, then make sure you subscribe, like the video, share it with your buddies, and tune in next time.